Does religion still make sense? Does it give meaning to the mystery of the universe? In our scientific and secular world, can we still believe, or perhaps we could turn the tables and say that those who aren't religious are the ones lacking a little common sense? Welcome back to the Attaching to God podcast. I am Geoff Holsclaw, your host. As always, we are brought to you by The Embodied Faith. Today, I'm really excited to have a guest on with us. This is Ross Douthat. He is a New York Times opinion columnist ever since 2009. Before that, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic. He has authored many books. A couple of them are The Decadent Society, Bad Religion, just to name a few. But most recently, he wrote Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And I love that you said religious and not spiritual, which we'll get to in a second. But Ross, thank you so much for being on with us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I saw your book come across probably my email, or I don't know. I was like, ooh, I wonder if somehow I could get him on the podcast. So thank you for being here.
Here I am.
Yes, I know. Yes, it's I recently just got an assistant to help me, and so it's like magic. Things just show up in
That's
my
right.
inbox.
People just appear. I'm actually an AI hologram of Ross Douthat, though. That's your assistant may not have mentioned that part. But
yeah, well, that's okay. We'll still promote this, extensively. So you do talk about AI for a little bit, but I actually wasn't going to get into that. But you at the beginning of your book, you note kind of a vibe shift from maybe 15, 20 years ago at the heyday of the militant new atheism. But now you know something different, especially in your younger colleagues. Could you just talk a little bit about some of the religious, spiritual shifts you've been seeing?
yeah, I think we've obviously gone through in American life a period of some kind of secularization or de-churching over the last 15 or 20 years. And the new atheists and that sort of intellectual moment wasn't obviously the only causal force, but I think it was an important kind of accelerant, right? This sense that, the world would just be better off if fewer people believed in an imaginary sky daddy and, a flying spaghetti monster, all these sort of terms of abuse that the new atheists flung at traditional religious believers. And I think we've reached a point in the culture where even if people aren't religious, they don't believe in that narrative anymore. Or it's not to say that nobody believes in it. It's obviously a big culture, but many fewer people find it compelling than did 15 or 20 years ago, right? And I think a big part of that is just comes from looking at the world around us, looking at the culture, looking at politics. And, you had this narrative that with less religion, the world would become more rational, more scientific, less polarized, less dogmatic, all of these things. And, nothing about reality in 2025 vindicates any of those predictions. It turns out that human beings can, be unhappily, ideologically divided without any faith at all. So you have that sense, right, that the new atheism made a bunch of promises that just haven't been fulfilled. Then you have a couple other things. You have, I think, a strong current of existential unhappiness in American culture right now, particularly youth culture that's visible in statistics on depression and anxiety and suicidality and all of these things. And again, I don't want to say that the decline of religion is the only force at work there. I think just the impact of phones and social media and digital life plays a certain role as well. But I definitely think you have a lot of people who are sort of uncertain about what human life is for and unhappy with the existing narratives about what it's for, what we're supposed to be doing in the world, why we should exist at all in some cases. And then finally, I think we've raised a generation in America, really for the first time maybe ever in American history, that just has almost no contact with institutional religion at all. So for a long time, if you were talking to someone who was a non-believer, you could assume that, they'd had some kind of experience with religion. They'd gone to Sunday school. Their parents had been Christmas and Easter Christians, something like that. Often they'd had a negative experience with religious authority that they were rebelling against. And again, that still exists, but you just have millions and millions of people for whom, you say the words like Cain and Abel, and who are Cain and Abel, right? Like just sort of
Right.
basic forms of cultural literacy about religion aren't there. And a lot of these people are themselves interested in religion. They just
Mm.
don't have any. They're sort of starting from ground zero, right? Starting completely afresh, and that's part of the idea behind this book was to kind of write into that moment to say, okay, you're looking at religion almost for the first time. What should you be looking for? Why does a religious perspective on the world make sense? And that, again, I think that
Mm-hmm.
environment is quite different from a world of 2001 or 2005, where institutional religion still had a little more authority. There was more of a sense of it as a thing to be rebelled against, rather than as a kind of mystery that people are curious about almost.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm like a low church evangelical, if we can still use those things, Vineyard Church. And a lot of people who, whether it's deconstructing or whatnot, they'll move away from religion and then talk about how they're being spiritual. But I'm seeing similar things that you just said, that there's a whole generation that would consider themselves spiritual, but they actually want to move toward the religious. And so I love that you're kind of speaking into that moment. Uh, you mentioned that so this is a quote I think from page 10. You said this book isn't about how religious stories are psychologically helpful, whatever their truth content, or about how religious communities offer a valuable solidarity even if their doctrines are made up, or how embracing the mystery of existence can make you happier. You say that's not what this book is about, right? So that it's not like the therapeutic or social benefits of religion, which some people just kind of lower the bar and say, yeah, there's a place for religion. But you actually want to make like a more rigorous kind of statement, almost an intellectual kind of argument. Now, why is it that you want to go that route rather than the therapeutic route, which I think a lot of people are doing right now?
Well, part of it is just that I think that the the claim that religion actually describes reality is ultimately a stronger claim than the therapeutic claim. It's not that I think the therapeutic claims are false exactly. I do think that religion has social benefits and that church going is good for people's psyches in various ways. I just think that first, a lot of those benefits are themselves downstream from the fact that God almost certainly exists, right? Like, and that helps explain why people seem to be in general somewhat happier when they're in some kind of
Mm-hmm.
relationship with that ultimate reality. There's also the reality. I don't get into this too much in the book, right? But I've written about it in other contexts, that if you spend too much time on the therapeutic side, you're obviously losing the part of Christianity in particular, but other religious traditions as well, that says, well, I mean, in the end, God might ask you to suffer and die, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's not, it's not therapeutic all the way down, or it is therapeutic in the ultimate sense, right? You're, going to go to heaven, but it's not some kind of guarantee of, it's not just some sort of guarantor of American middle class existence, even if it is helpful in certain ways in middle class existence. But yeah, I think that there's, again, in this sort of zone of people who are exploring religion and interested in religion and so on, I think they get a lot of pitches that say, okay, it's hard to believe in God, it's hard to be a serious modern person and take seriously the virgin birth, or whatever stumbling block
Mm-hmm.
looms large. But why don't you just come and practice religion, try it, see how it works, and maybe you'll come to some kind of stronger belief that way. And for some people, I think that's good advice. Certainly, again, world's a diverse place. A lot of people come to religion in a lot of different ways. But I think there are a lot of people who could just benefit from having a sense that, in fact, that decision to go to church or, return to faith or explore a new faith or something is itself a rational decision, right? That
Mm-hmm.
it's not just a kind of existentialist leap into the unknown. There is sort of an unknowable aspect, obviously, and an intensely personal aspect to religion. I'm not saying that you can reason your way into a grace-filled relationship with Jesus Christ. I am saying, though, that you can reason your way into thinking that maybe you should have a grace-filled relationship with Jesus Christ, and that reasoning, in the end, gives people a more secure line to practice and belief than does just a kind of instrumentalist case. And it's interesting. I've had a lot of these conversations with secular interviewers and sort of somewhat religious people. And, in one of them, someone said, well, aren't you making it harder, right? Isn't it easier to just, not have a full commitment to the beliefs, but just sort of go to church and see what happens? And again, to me, it's the opposite, right? It's actually very hard to practice Christianity and even in a kind of minimal way. Like, I'm Catholic. We have a Sunday obligation. You got to get your kids to mass, right? That's very challenging. I find that personally a lot more challenging than just following what I think is pretty strong evidence that the universe has an underlying order and that, God has some kind of intention for us. But then believing that makes it easier to drag my kids to church on Sunday. And I think there's at least some number of people who are in the same position who are going to be more likely to practice religion if they feel like there's a basic rational foundation for what you do on Sunday morning and, hopefully not just on Sunday morning.
Yeah. The old Augustinian kind of phrase is faith seeking understanding, but you're kind of also reversing that. It seems a little bit like, well, a little understanding can help at least bolster the pursuit of faith.
Yes,
And
well,
those
it's
two
like,
things belong together.
right. If you go back to the New Testament and look at, Paul, I think in Romans, right, where he basically makes the argument that the pagans, the people he's preaching to, right, they hadn't been given the revelation of the Old Testament or the New Testament, but they had been given a set of signs and indicators that should have made them aware that there probably is a God, right? And I think that's always been an assumption of Christian faith, that there are things that are revealed by revelation and things that you can have and experience only through God's grace. But the basic orientation toward God is a reasonable one and a sound starting place.
Mm-hmm. Well, so there's too much that we can't get into, and I love you have a couple chapters on kind of order found in the cosmos, the mystery of the human mind and consciousness, and how early on in the modern age, the Enlightenment, they thought that science was going to dismiss all this stuff about faith, but now, the most recent advanced findings in cosmology, but also consciousness, they seem to leave a lot of room for faith and religion, which we could talk about. But I was really interested in your chapter on overturning the myth of disenchantment or the myth of secularism. Can we talk about that a little bit? How do angels and demons and crystals and chakras and kind of how does all that become an argument for religion?
Yeah,
And UFOs and
right,
near-death
yeah, the
experiences.
UFOs.
We got all of them.
Yeah,
They're good ones.
I do take a very open-minded stance towards different flavors of supernatural experience, but the baseline argument is, as you said, that the idea that we live in a disenchanted world, that the modern world has sort of banished supernatural experience, is just empirically false. And it's falsified every day in a million different places by people who seek out or don't seek out and have anyway the same kinds of weird supernatural-ish experiences that people were having in the Middle Ages and the ancient world, ranging from, visions and psychic flashes to encounters with otherworldly seeming beings to miraculous seeming healings to near-death experiences and so on. All of that has persisted in profound ways, even as sort of official knowledge, what I call official knowledge, has become disenchanted, right? So yes, it's the case that if you go hang out at Yale Law School or, in places where in people who publish academic journals and so on, right, there is a default exclusion of the supernatural, and that's real. That is a kind of disenchantment, but it is a kind of, it's like a thin layer of sort of disenchanted assumptions set over a world that seems to be fundamentally unchanged in how much people are experiencing the supernatural. And I think even before you get into the details, I think that alone is a certain kind of blow against materialism and atheism, because if you go back and read, a lot of Enlightenment era writers and skeptics, there was a real assumption that, once you didn't have established churches and compulsory Bible reading and all of these things, that belief in the weird and fringe and supernatural and paranormal wouldn't go away, but it would diminish markedly, right? Because the reason people believed in these things was because priests were telling them to believe. And I think by now we can say it's clear that that's not true. The reason people believe in these things is because people keep having these experiences, and it's just a persistent feature of human existence, in a way that doesn't falsify atheism, but should raise some serious doubts about it. And then, when you get into the particulars, I don't think you can build a case for one specific religious tradition just based on the broad evidence of supernatural experience. It's not that, everyone who has a mystical experience has a vision of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Which would be convenient for Christians if it were true, but that's not what happens. There does seem to be ways in which these experiences are bound by cultural and religious expectations, pre-existing beliefs, these kind of things. But there are also just, patterns. Like the supernatural experience isn't random. There are patterns to these experiences. There are clear patterns to near-death experiences, features that recur across cultures, across religious traditions. There are sort of patterns of direct experience. There's sort of experiences of non-human beings that fall into different categories. The case of UFOs, I think, is part of a thread that runs back to experiences with, in the Western tradition, people would say with fairies. In Native American traditions, you would say with like trickster figures in Native American mythology. That fits uneasily into Christian theology. I don't think it is necessarily in contradiction with it. Certainly, medieval Christians didn't have trouble believing that there could be some supernatural powers besides just the devil and Saint Michael at work in the world. But it is true that like the breadth of data on supernatural experience, doesn't fit perfectly with sort of every formal Christian commitment. I would say I don't think it necessarily contradicts it, and I think it does provide a really wide range of persistent, not predictable, but like somewhat predictable ways that, supernatural realities impinge on our material existence in every time and place. And that is, I think, as important a case for being religious as any of the arguments from cosmology and consciousness and design, the sort of more scientifically respectable arguments.
Yeah. And none of these, and you make this clear in the book, none of these are like knockout arguments for why religions, but they're just cumulative. They're just like, there's a lot of evidence. It's reasonable.
There's
to kind of
convergence.
lean
There's
this way.
convergence is how I would
Yeah.
put it. You would say, well, we live in a universe that exhibits evidence of design, and we have a consciousness that appears to be, in the image of God in some particular way in terms of its, surprising capacities and nature. And we have lots of intimations of higher powers wanting to be in touch with us and so on, right? And each one does not, dismiss atheism automatically. It's not like you pick, one of Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways to God and say, that's it, it's over for the atheists. But the universe, the point is that the universe in which we find ourselves along multiple dimensions looks more like the universe as religious believers describe it than it does as the universe that Richard Dawkins describes.
Yeah. And I like the cumulative arguments that it's not that, faith is just utterly transparent, through the universe, but it's not totally opaque either. It's not like God's hiding from us. I especially like, just as a digression, I loved your dig against emergence theory as an explanation for consciousness as its own kind of magical or mystical thinking, which I've always thought. I studied philosophy of mind with David Chalmers way back in the
Oh,
day.
yeah.
It's just like, this is a hard problem. And when you make it too easy and you just sprinkle a little chaos theory and emergence in there and call it a day, I'm just like, that's just like saying the triune God made consciousness in the Logos's image. Like it's, anyway, so I love all those little things you have in there.
I appreciate it. And it is sort of a source of frustration. I was having a nice lunch with a secular journalist the other day, and he was like, well, I've always just assumed that we're going to, consciousness, it emerges somehow, and maybe it has something to do with quantum fluctuations or something. And it's like, okay,
Uh-huh.
then maybe it does, but what is your actual account how of how that happens? If you don't have such an account, you're not in a different position from the people claiming that mind is an irreducible feature of the cosmos. You're the one casting around for sort of hypotheticals that don't actually deliver the scientific goods. I do think this is an important thing, that like
Hmm.
there are particular ways in which, Copernicus and Galileo or Charles Darwin, right, like deliver actual empirical challenges to things that religious institutions say and believe, right? Where it's like, okay,
Hmm.
you can look through the telescope and see what's happening here. And there are good reasons why those kind of scientific arguments challenge and upset religious convictions. I think we're in a world though where the current sort of materialist atheist alternatives to religious explanations are not, they're not that kind of thing. Like
Hmm.
multiverse theory, right? Maybe it's true, but it's not something you're going to look through a telescope and prove. It's not this kind of like empirically testable system that is being offered as an alternative to metaphysical speculation. It's just metaphysical speculation of its own sort.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and now you have, we're definitely going off the rabbit trail, but and you mentioned like the, panpsychism and these other alternatives for how mind could emerge in the midst of our universe. And it's just like, that's great, but that's a metaphysical construct that has zero difference than believing in a triune God who created all things. They'd want to say there's an abundant difference, but I'm not sure there is.
I'm
Well,
not, yeah, the panpsychists. I mean, I have a certain respect for the panpsychists. Like, I think
yeah,
it might, C.S.
very
Lewis's
plausible.
Narnia, right? It's like, yeah, the trees have some kind of consciousness. The dryads, are there. But I do
Mhm.
think panpsychism, if you take it seriously, maybe it doesn't get you to classical theism. But I think if I were a panpsychist, I would be a pantheist, right? I would say, okay,
Mhm.
if mind is present throughout the cosmos, it has to have some ultimate expression, and we should call that, again, maybe a pantheistic god, not a classical theist god. But yeah, I don't. I think once you start down that route, you end up in religious territory.
Yeah. Well, so you start off the first couple chapters making these kind of arguments in these different domains, but you don't just want to lay it up with something like, and it's okay to be open to the spiritual. You then have a chapter called The Case for Commitment. So you're not just arguing for a general spirituality, but actually some sort of like, not, I was going to say pushing, but you're inviting people into taking
A
up
little push.
actual. Yeah, a little
Yeah,
push. Okay, I
just
like the
push.
push. I like the push, but my wife is more of a spiritual director, and so everything for her is an invitation. And sometimes I'm like, but you can push a little. So it's a push invitation, and you give a couple reasons for why maybe we should commit to what you'd call one of the big religions. Of course, you and I are Christians with those commitments, but I just want to go through the three of them, and you can kind of just fill it out a little bit. But one, and I love this, is you basically just say it's likely that you're not a religious genius. So maybe you should adopt a religion. Could you fill that out a little bit?
Yes, I mean, this is, again, one of my suggestions is that you shouldn't regard religion as this special domain that, you know, is different from every other domain of human life and can't be reasoned about and so on. But it's like, suppose you became really interested in political philosophy and you thought political philosophy was a really big deal. It would be, probably a mistake to start your education in political philosophy by declaring that you were setting up your own completely novel school that no one had thought of before, and you were going to, mix some Plato with some John Stuart Mill and craft something new and brilliant and perfect. Now, we both know people who have that impulse, right? And occasionally
Yes.
they're an actual genius, but most of the time you are better off assuming that, the long human conversation has generated a particular set of traditions for a reason. And you want to enter into one of those traditions, not setting aside all of your curiosity and just sort of submitting yourself blindly, but saying, look, this tradition seems to me likely to be closest to the truth, and I'm going to discipline myself and educate myself by entering into it and by joining that particular conversation rather than, sort of setting yourself up immediately as a church of one just seems very unlikely to be the wisest course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all throughout your arguments is a push, maybe your word, not mine, a push against like modern individualism. Like we can't just create these things all on our own. And that goes to the second one, which is basically joining a religion because no one's an island. And you give a word picture of like if someone says they're interested in soccer and they talk a lot about it, but they never join a team, you'd think at some level, that they're just kind of pretending. Or could
Right.
you fill that out a little bit
Yeah,
about
I mean,
like just
that's
joining the team?
the soccer team analogy is, again, a non-religious analogy to religion, but there are all kinds of ways um, in which participation is essential to improvement and seriousness and everything else. And some of that relates to just, the reality that it's hard to do things alone. It's hard to learn that much alone without teachers and fellow students and so on. Some of it relates to the fact that peer pressure is very helpful to get you to continue with something that you started. As I said earlier, right? It's challenging just to, to do the basics of religion, to get to mass and pray and go to church and these kind of things. And trying to set that up all on your own without some network of friends and teachers is likely to go badly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just generally, and this is where you sort of do get a bit into the therapeutic benefits of religion, right? Like I don't think that's not the most important argument, but it is a legitimate one, right? Like there are just benefits that you draw from community itself that are really hard to reproduce outside a religious community. And then finally, well, maybe this is segueing into the third, but I'll just segue, right? Is that this kind of community and sort of institutions and teachers is also a form of protection. Because if you assume that some kind of supernatural realm exists, there's no reason to assume that, it has no dangers or perils, that it's, that you can't get lost there, that every force you encounter there has your good in mind. If the natural world is filled with perils and difficulties, it's quite likely that the supernatural world would be as well. And there, I think in particular, the danger of being spiritual but not religious is sharpest, right? It's that, you have a religious experience and you don't have anything to test it against. You don't have anyone to say, well, is this definitely from God? Is it, maybe it's not, you don't have to believe in demons. Maybe it's like from your own ego, right? Maybe it's from, or you might believe in demons. You might want to worry about them, right? So there too, the big old religions take for granted that the soul can be lost, right? That things can go awry, and not every spiritual power has your best interest at heart. And the idea of both guidance and protection, I think, is a really powerful and important idea.
Yeah, and thank you so much for bringing that up too. In my notes, it was the last one was beware the demons. Was
Yes, right, yep.
was point three, and I think that's really important because when you move from like the older view of like, oh, we're religious, but we're just going to be spiritual, there is kind of this, especially like among Westerners who have maybe grown up in the secular, demythologized world, disenchanted world. There's kind of a naivete about like the spiritual realm, like, oh, it'll just be great. And the same with like the psychonauts. And I interviewed a woman, doing psychedelics and,
Yeah,
and whether it's engaging in magic or psychedelics and altered states, like there is kind of this cheery, like it's so fun to adventure and experiment. But then when you start compiling these stories and you hear people have been in that world for a long time, you start seeing the dark underbelly of experiences that, you know, are pretty dark. So I liked how you named well, we need to kind of get over this spiritual tourism or voyeurism kind of mentality when it comes to the spiritual, and understand like most cultures outside the West, like they understand it's dangerous, and they
right.
take
Even
precautions, and
cultures
people
that
go,
use psychedelics, sort of more traditional cultures, as I understand it, tend to hedge them around with lots of prohibitions and taboos, and like you don't become a shaman like overnight, right? Like, I mean, this is with psychedelics, it's sort of like if if they open into genuine spiritual experiences, you are essentially accelerating to experiences that in most religious traditions someone would only have after, a lifetime of prayer and fasting and meditation and religious instruction and so on. And there's absolutely no reason to think that, the average guy in, let's say, Silicon Valley, hypothetically, is spiritually prepared from being for being thrust into whatever realm is opened up by those experiences.
Why did you have to throw my home area? I was raised there. Why'd you have to
I
throw it
was
under the
listen.
bus?
I was born in San Francisco. It's
Okay. I'm
not
from San Jose. We're on the opposite ends there.
Listen, Silicon Valley is an extremely important and interesting zone of American life, but it
Yes.
is a place where some people may be slightly incautious in their spiritual ambitions. I think I would say that.
No, absolutely. Well, I know Nassim Taleb, if I'm saying that right, the anti-fragile guy. He's great, and he argues for that the deep old traditions of religion, kind of the accumulated wisdom that safeguards humanity from their own destruction. It's like, maybe it's not the best human flourishing, but it's going to keep us from, kind of following into the deep kind of pits. And there's
Yes,
some kind of reasoning to that.
a certain at the very least minimal. That's sort of the minimalist case
Right.
for the big traditions. Yes.
Right. What you talk about different stumbling blocks to this religious search, which are really great. You cover this like problem of evil and suffering. Why do religious institutions, do such evil things? And you also talk about why do religions talk about sex so much? And you give great kind of understandings. You really turn the tables on people with that. But I want to just shift a little bit to your own, I guess, commitments or your own spiritual kind of heritage. Could you talk a little bit about kind of how you and your family a little before you kind of fell into faith and how you journeyed your way toward Catholicism a little bit?
Yeah, so I had an maybe unusual background in that I was sort of a passenger for my parents' religious pilgrimage. So I
Mm,
experienced a lot of different forms of American Christianity as a kid, going from Episcopalianism and mainline Protestantism through Pentecostalist and charismatic worlds, a kind of evangelical stint, and then we ended up as Roman Catholics when I was about 17.
mm,
And one of the reasons that I have an interest in and a respect for supernatural experience is that I saw a lot of it. And I saw a lot of it, sort of falling upon people who I knew and trusted and knew were not, insane or schizophrenic or anything else, right? And people who were having, at the beginning, completely unexpected spiritual
mm,
and supernatural experiences. And at the same time, I didn't really have them myself. I was not a mystical personality as a kid.
mm.
I'm still not, although, maybe I'm a little more permeable than I was back
That's
then.
a
But,
good
when
word.
that's happening, right, when people around you are having experiences and you aren't, I imagine it could yield a kind of deep skepticism, right? It's like, well, if this isn't happening to me, it must be fake. But in my
Mhm.
case, it yielded an assumption that, okay, some people have these experiences and some people don't, but they're obviously real and not adequately explained by existing methods of explanation and should be taken seriously, right? And that's something that I've definitely carried from my childhood experience all the way to the present and writing this book. I
Mm,
would say in
mhm.
Catholicism, what I, you know, over the years, but including at the start, appreciated about Catholicism was that it had a kind of institutional and intellectual structure that appealed to me as a sort of would-be rationalist, someone who's interested in intellectual argument and debate. But it also has this really strong and often very weird mystical tradition that incorporates some of the kinds of things that I saw happening in charismatic Christianity as a kid, right? So it
Mm,
has sort of both aspects of religion and religious belief. Um,
mm,
but then the point that I end the book with, right, is that I think if you just look at sort of the raw data on religion, the you know evidence for design, spiritual experience, and so on, it doesn't get you all the way to a particular religious commitment. It gets you to a general interest in religion and an openness to the big religions, the idea that they're all sort of getting at something that's out there. But to get all the way to commitment, you have to find one particular religious story more compelling than the others, and a more, a strong, you want to feel strongly that this is the place where God intervened in the most profound and important way, and therefore this is the revelation through which we should read all the other data, right? I use the term controlling revelation, which sounds a little bit maybe overly technical, but that is how I think about my own Christianity, how I think about the Gospels and the New Testament and the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, as when I was young, I find it to just be distinctive among the origin stories of the major religions, distinctive among all the stories of world history in terms of its mix of flagrant supernaturalism and historical credibility. And I'm very comfortable sort of making that the sort of fixed point around which all this other data and analysis and interest can orbit, right? And it's not that everything fits perfectly at every given moment, but I'm very confident with and comfortable in the idea that starting with Jesus, starting with the Gospels, in terms of figuring out, what is God doing in the world, that's a really good bet.
Well, I agree.
Well, preaching to the choir, as it were.
Yeah. Well, I did really appreciate just kind of that, the case for Christianity that you give at the end. Just to finish here, maybe on a slightly more personal note, and this is kind of like the verse for this whole podcast, in a sense. The Bible doesn't talk about attaching to God in those words, but it does talk about clinging and love. And Paul in Philippians 3:12, he's talking about his participation or his longing to participate in the death and life of Christ. And he says, I haven't already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ took hold of me. And there's like this, and I love that verse, there's this mutual clinging. And so whether it's like intellectual or maybe experiential, how have you experienced, or maybe through the process of writing this book, like what is it that you cling on to that you also maybe retroactively find out that God was like clinging onto you in the process? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there, on the personal side, it's actually more the experience that I wrote about in my last book, which was a book about having a chronic illness, having chronic Lyme disease, which sort of fell on me unexpectedly in my mid-30s, redirected me in various ways where I lived, sort of some of the choices I made and the things that I valued, right? And that was an experience that I think intensified my faith and also just sort of my sense of God's providence, sometimes his harsh providence, but just a sense of sort of God's control over your life at a certain level, right? And the need to try and figure out how to live under his providence in a way that matches your own choices onto what he has in mind. And I don't think of that experience. That experience has less to do with this book, because I don't think it's a fully compelling argument for religious belief to someone who hasn't had that experience, right? Because obviously, you can just say from the outside, well, you were suffering and unhappy, and so of course you needed to think that God was in control. That fit a psychological need, and of course the answer is yes. It absolutely did. It was a crutch, it was a prop, it was a support, it was all of those things, right? So I think that's not the place where I would start if I were trying to talk to a non-believer or a skeptic. But if I'm talking about my own relationship with God, and also my own view of larger things, I write about politics and history and everything else for a living, right? And I think, become more of a providentialist generally, less inclined to write columns where I'm like shaking my fist at events and saying, how could this possibly happen? And more inclined to write columns where I'm saying, where is this going? This is this is an interesting story. Maybe it looks bad, right? Things aren't going that well, but let's see where it's going, and let's sort of try and figure out what kind of larger story we're embedded in. And you don't always. Sometimes it's hard to figure that out. I would appreciate more direct dictation from God sometimes about what I'm supposed to do and what certain things happening in the world mean. But certainly the experience of going through a severe illness has strengthened my sense that that's what you're looking for. You're looking for the larger arc that providence has in mind for your own life and for history.
Yeah. Just for listeners, that other book that Ross wrote is The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery. And it does touch on a little bit in an earlier chapter. You talk about the stumbling blocks. And I think there is a sense in which there is an apologetic there, because you talk about how most often the problem of pain or suffering is used against faith by people who don't really experience really deep pain and suffering. And the historical data would say those who suffer the most, civilizations and or people individually,
Yeah.
seem to reach out toward God. And so it is, isn't it? And I like you say it pretty diplomatically, but you say, well, who are we who are so privileged to say that the sufferers are wrong in their belief in God? And so, and I think
Yes, I think
there
I
is
think
something
that
there.
I think that works as a gentle pushback against
Yeah.
secular overconfidence. I think the people who are in the strongest position to lodge the complaint against God are people who are in the thick of suffering themselves. And some of those people do lose faith and do have
Right.
a sort of direct complaint and a direct reason to say, I don't think God exists. But yes, I think a large part of the support for the argument from evil against God's existence is in this weird way connected to comfort. This sense that like we suffer less, and so when we do suffer, it feels more unfair and more outrageous. And I think that that is a flawed approach to understanding the issue, at the very least.
Well, that goes with, maybe just to finish then, it goes with your broader conviction that religion is somehow connected to reality, and that reality makes demands on us. And so we can't always be in the position to demand of reality. Sometimes reality, God, religion is, like the suffering is a part of it, the pain is a part of it. I did an interview with Andrew Root on his new book, and he basically says the thing that Christianity has to offer that no other place does is, where do you bring your suffering?
Yep.
And that's kind of the non-therapeutic kind of gospel is, it's not that there is no suffering, but what is God doing about all of our suffering? And in fact, we just celebrated Easter, and the truth is, well, God has entered into our suffering and done something about it from the inside. And so,
Yes,
and
it's
that's good
not,
news.
that argument is not, I don't think it's a logical proof that sort of mathematically makes sense of the precise amount of suffering in the universe. But it is clearly, for believing Christians, a strong divine response to suffering, and a very powerful one.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as we finish, is there one last thing that you hope this book would kind of stir up in people, or make them take a gentle push, a stumbling push forward?
I mean, I think the push is important. I've been really
Yeah.
struck by, in a lot of my conversations, how many non-believers who I've done interviews with are not actually defending a hard materialism or a hard atheism. And maybe this goes back to the point we started with, that like the moment has changed, times have changed, right? But I feel like I've had a lot of conversations with people who say, Ross, I think you're probably right that, there's more to the world than just atoms and cells, right? That there's some big mystery here. But calling it God, that seems like a little much. Or getting all the way to Christianity, that seems like a little much, right? So my genuine hope for the project is that I can sort of give a push, impart a little more urgency to people sort of occupying this zone of ambiguity right now, who feel like there's something out there, but am I really going to go all the way to religion? And I'm here to say, well, consider taking at least one more step.
Yeah. Well, good. So it's both a push and an invitation.
And an
Well, thank you.
invitation. That's right. A pull, a tug. Yeah.
That's right. The push and pull. It's good, depending on what you need. Thank you again so much. The book is called Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. There's so many good things. I'll be sharing this, with my skeptics and faith adjacent people. I live in the worlds of people who are deconstructing, and so I love all the work that you did there. And thank you for all the work you're doing in other places.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the conversation. I really appreciate it.